When you're trying to answer questions in marketing, you have to be thinking about what are the data models that I need to build in order to be able to answer that. And your CMO and your marketing leaders are probably not asking you for data models. They're asking you for answers to their questions. And as the operations leader and the analyst leader, you have to go back and say, well, where does this fit in either my existing data models or do I need to build something new? Because you can get all of these answers. We are identifying different ways that we can answer these questions without it taking the single model that maybe we have focused on so much around funnel tracking or something else.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Revenue Growth Architects podcast. It's Charlie here, and I'm here as always with Chrissy and Xander, and again with another special guest, Alison, our Chief Architect and Analyst at CS2. So today we're diving into, should you track pre-sales ready stages? It's a question that comes up a lot with clients. It's very nuanced, as everything is. I feel like that we discuss in this podcast and that we do in our day job. So a lot to talk about. So kicking it off, I'm going to get Chrissy to explain kind of how we got here. What is the history of tracking these pre-sales ready stages? What even are pre-sales ready stages, and why do people want to track them?
So it all started. No, when I think about the funnel, I mean, I started my career at Marketo, so like the images of like a funnel were just all over our office, always something that was always staring at. And what we brought to the market at that time was just showing what does that funnel look like. And it always started with like, you have anonymous and then known and then engaged and then MQL and then kind of all the way through. And a lot of other analysts or, thought leaders of the market always kind of showed that picture and that type of funnel. And so everyone kind of latched onto that. Like, okay, that's how we need to track things. I think and we just looked at it as like one funnel. Okay, that's our funnel, But the thing is there's some flaw to that of what we're seeing. Like, that's not really the funnel, like there are some pre-funnel stages or things that happen before technically when we say a funnel starts. And because when you think about it, it's like if you think about things just net new, when someone becomes, new person in your database or new person that you're like tracking for the first time, yes, they'll maybe go into a known stage or an engaged stage if they engage the first time. But once they go in, become an MQL, they're not going to go back to any of those stages before because now they've already started what we think is the funnels, starting the funnel at MQL. Because the thing is, you'll always, you might have to go backward and start a funnel again. And you're not doing that at the engaged stage again. You would likely then, become recycled and then, or sent to nurture, whatever you call it at your organization, and then become an MQL again. And so the way that we think about it is, there's, these pre-sales ready stages are almost kind of like your pre-funnel stages. And it's really important for kind of that first journey a lot of the time and for new business. And so I think one of the things that relates to why marketers are still really hung up on like tracking these as stages is, one, because we've always been told to do that. But two is they've always been so focused on MQL generation. And how do I generate MQLs? Like they've always been tied to a number. And so they're always looking at, okay, what's our, engaged or our, lead, like top of funnel conversion rate to MQL, because that's probably what they're, basing their plans off of. That's how they were picking their campaigns back in the day. Like literally I would work with marketers and they would like have just a goal on MQLs. Well, now we know that things have kind of changed since then. Marketers a bit more focused on pipeline, and they are still focused on MQLs or sales ready leads. But I think it's not just that initial, like, how do I actually generate MQLs that they get so hung up on. But there are ways that you can track that. There are ways that you can track that more effectively. And I think that's what we want to dive into today is, how do you track the, pre-funnel, pre-sales ready stages? When is that important? And how can you get the data that you're probably looking for, but not having to maybe track it as a stage? per se.
Yeah. So, Alison, I'd love you to dig into how you think about the fact that there's two slightly different models here that are answering different questions between these pre-funnel stages, the funnel stages, and how much of this is semantics versus how much of this is actually like these are two different separate things. We need to think about them differently, and being able to actually distinguish between them can help people use them better. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of goes back to what Chrissy mentioned, being that those pre-sales ready stages are only attained once. And there's a lot of focus on optimizing that new business kind of funnel where you acquire a lead, they become engaged, they become an MQL, they get work, they turn into an opportunity, they're close one, now they're a customer. Whereas there's been a greater focus as well in tracking an expansion funnel as well, or, cross sells and upsells. And so tracking those pre-funnel stages in an expansion funnel doesn't quite make sense. And so the two different data models that we're talking about is the first attainment of each stage on their way to becoming a customer versus when their sales process starts and when it ends and when it starts again and when it ends again. And being able to optimize once it starts, how quickly is it converting? Where are the bottlenecks? And so, yeah, so typically our funnel starts at sales ready or MQL, and we're measuring each time someone becomes an MQL and what happens. And so trying to add those pre-sales ready stages into that model doesn't work because it's a one-to-one versus a one-to-many. But, it's still recommended to track, like when somebody first becomes engaged and when someone becomes an MQL, and even optimizing that. But the way you might optimize that is, what are you doing to get those people who maybe downloaded a white paper on your website but aren't yet an MQL? What are you doing with those people to try to get them more engaged and raise their hand? And measure the effectiveness of those marketing programs. Because if you optimize those marketing programs, you'll naturally just see a higher volume of sales ready. And that's sort of the way to optimize that.
Yeah. So what are some of the downsides to calling these stages? Because we're trying to kind of articulate that, when we're talking about our funnel stages, we want that process to be able to apply to kind of sales process starting for new business, sales process starting for upsell, sales process restarting for either of those. So we want to make sure that those stages you are able to kind of go through them, multiple times and recycle through in different ways. So therefore, calling the pre-funnel, calling it, I don't want to even call them stages. So calling the pre-funnel, getting that pre-funnel data and calling them stages. What are the risks associated with that, and like what confusion does that generally cause? Do you want to take that one, Xander?
Yeah. I think that it's important to be able to measure conversion rates before it becomes an MQL, because otherwise you potentially have the risk of just throwing in a bunch of people in your database and not doing anything with them. But when you do start to talk about stages, something that I find is that people just think about it like, okay, this quarter I'm going to get this many engaged people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what about all of the people that are sitting in recycled that you've already spent money to bring on and probably already had them talking with sales, and maybe there was something that caused them to not want to buy? Well, if you're only thinking about these brand new people coming into the database and so focused on new, you lose sight of your previous investments. So when you have a singular funnel and you're including known and engaged, you're really like, it's an interesting data point, but you're kind of excluding the rest of your potential buyers in that model. And so, it can simply be another slide. It can simply be another slide of, here's how many new names we got this month. Here's how many recycled people that we brought back into a funnel. Here's how many people that we are, that we got engagement out of, because that's really what we're just trying to say is who's interested in us, but we haven't been able to get them to raise their hand or do enough to score up. So being able to measure that, you don't necessarily need like a field to do so. You can just call it, what was my first engagement date, my first activity date, my first campaign response date, like whatever it might be, and then leverage that to build out metrics without, conflating it with the rest of your funnel that you're trying to measure.
I love that.
Yeah.
What gets measured gets managed, right? And if you're focusing too much on those like being stages and goals around that, then yeah, maybe you're focusing less on what might be arguably more important.
I think
any other risks?
I think one kind of like anecdote to that too of like why it's important is kind of mainly around what Alison was talking around the basically the different funnel journeys that you can have. And when you do have an MQL that gets generated, say for like a second or third time, and this is very apparent when you have just a lead and contact method. Like you could be then looking at, like, say you stamp the engage date and then you're looking at MQL date and you potentially might be overriding that, like, which has its problems. We talk about that in other past episodes. But then you look at the engage date versus MQL date and you're like, that took like 2 years for them to MQL. It's like, no, you just overwrote the last journey also. And even if you didn't, if you're trying to compare that, it just isn't right. It just isn't right, So then even if you're tracking that metric, if you're doing it the wrong way, if you're tracking that conversion the wrong way, you're including all your MQLs compared to that engaged date, like it's always going to look horrible. So I think it's a good thing to track just for your first journey for a new business. But when we're talking about the overall method for tracking your funnel, that's why it should start at when they're starting that journey again, instead of including that previous stage. Because otherwise, like the data is pointless and useless, and it's probably going to make you think that you're operating worse than you are when you look at it that way.
Any risks that you see, Alison?
In tracking,
or any risks or kind of mistakes people make when they're trying to track these pre-funnel stages?
I think it's just the data model itself. Like, again, the 1-to-1 versus 1-to-many. And even if you are tracking multiple journeys, like we have some clients that are overriding the MQL date. We have others that are creating a new life cycle every time someone MQLs. But either way, those pre-funnel stages are only attained once. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of the third time someone MQL'd, now your velocity is skewed. So if you really want to track kind of the funnel to become a new customer, you need a different data model that is 1-to-1, where you're tracking the first attainment of each stage. Because otherwise, if you're doing the multi-journey, then don't include those life cycle stages in your model, because then it'll skew your velocity, it'll skew your conversion.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put on my devil's advocate hat for a second, because this is a common pushback that I've heard before over the years. I'm sure I know what you all might say to this, but I'm still curious to see what this might bring up. Why can't someone re-engage? So can we're saying that you can only go through those pre-funnel stages once, and I agree with that, but I have heard clients ask, well, what happens if they engage, but then it's been a couple of years? Can I put them back to not engaged, and then can they go to engaged again? Like, I'd love to hear how we would help articulate the value of not doing that and explain kind of like the right path forward.
I can chime in. So one thing that I have found valuable is, and it's less of tracking it again as a reattainment of an engaged stage, but at a prior company, we had an ABM kind of model, and most of our target accounts were current customers where we were trying to expand within the account. And so one thing that became really important to track is we already had most of our contacts our target market was in our database. And so it was less about attaining unknown to known to engage. It was more about re-engaging our existing database. So one thing that we started to track was how many contacts at our target accounts have not engaged with marketing in 6+ months that we got to re-engage. And so it's a different kind of measurement. It's not a stage attainment, but there are ways to measure that, looking at, the campaign history and how long between and how old the record is. And so it's just kind of a different type of report, but still something that you can get to understand those folks that haven't engaged and what it takes for them to re-engage.
Yeah, I think a big important thing here is around like there's a difference between a stage and there's a stage and like engagement data, right? It's good to track both, but maybe not conflating the two. What do you think, Zana?
We haven't gone out to say this, but we have been saying this, and that is when you're trying to answer questions in marketing, you have to be thinking about what are the data models that I need to build in order to be able to answer that. And your CMO and your marketing leaders are probably not asking you for data models. They're asking you for answers to their questions. And as the operations leader and the analyst leader, you have to go back and say, well, where does this fit in either my existing data models, or do I need to build something new? Because you can get all of these answers. We are identifying different ways that we can answer these questions without it taking the single model that maybe we have focused on so much around funnel tracking or something else. So that's my big takeaway. Like when I'm speaking with clients, I'll talk about, okay, well, we're going to work on a funnel metrics and we're going to work on a process here, and engaged isn't going to be a part of that conversation. And then they're immediately like, I won't have visibility into engaged. It's like, no, that's fine. We can still build a data model to get that for you. And we can find a way to get you a report that's showing that success and offering some advice there. But, we're more of a Swiss Army knife than a one size fits all sort of capability here, but we have to build to that, and we can't just inherit it from a single model.
Does anyone here have any advice on how to articulate that to leadership? So you've explained that two different data models. We have, the remit from the top is I want to see my final data, or I want to get that improved. And maybe you've had this conversation around like engaged. It's not going to be in the same data model as our funnel, but we can report on it differently. Maybe we have to do that project, separately after the funnel project. Like what are some ways some ways to explain these differences that are quite kind of abstract, or you have to understand the technical, there's the data modeling side, like, how are we going to try and build a representation of reality to help us make decisions? And then there's like, how do we actually build that? Like technically, how do we prioritize that on our roadmap? Like, how have we gone around how have we been able to articulate that well to leadership to try and get them on board with making this decision to start the funnel at sales ready? Particularly, or maybe even if you just have advice and just generally getting this concept across to leadership that you're asking me questions, I need to figure out the right data model to help give you that answer.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything really fancy outside of what you just landed at, Charlie. Sometimes less is more. Right. And without going into the details of, dear CMO, I have to go build out a data model and I have to do this. Like, it's important for us to understand that. And something that we can say is starting with what are those questions that they're trying to answer. We may be able to get them answers to that with our existing infrastructure without like making a big deal out of it. Right. So maybe just identifying what can we do. And then if we can't do that, if there are going to be gaps, then we start to work at building that out into your roadmap and just focusing on what's the priority. I think that most CMOs, especially right now, are trying to figure out how can I optimize things that I'm already delivering to sales. and really making sure that you're prioritizing accordingly, without losing sight of the other important questions that you may have.
Yeah, I like that. One thing that I would say, but actually I'll pause. Alison, do you want to, sounds like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing that can help too is building an analytics framework and with kind of like your canonical set of dashboards where you're outlining, okay, these are the questions you can answer with this dashboard. And this is how you go about finding answers to those questions. And then if there are questions that can't be answered by those dashboards, that's where you can kind of explain like, oh, we can build a data model to do this. Or I know sometimes you need to lightly explain why something's maybe more of a vanity metric. And hey, actually, if we take action upon these more actionable things, I think we'll see, more improvement, more ROI on our investments. But yeah.
Yeah, I think to that last point, that's so critical. I think everyone has questions and a lot of questions. And if you work at an organization with a lot of marketers and a lot of salespeople, and you're the one marketing operations person, you're just inundated with questions. But what are the outcomes that they're actually trying to get to? What are the actions that they're trying to have a data-backed action from? And being able to distinguish between someone's just got a question that's actually not going to lead to action versus someone's got a question they're actually trying to make a decision is a bit of the magic here, because you could get completely bogged down with trying to answer everyone's questions with data and building data models that they're just never going to actually is not going to improve the business. So I think being able to think that one step further when the CMO is coming to you with these questions and go, okay, well, maybe even asking them, like, what are you actually trying to do with this data first? But if they are not able to give you a good response, maybe that's a red flag. But also trying to think like, okay, what are they actually trying to action from this? And that's going to help you prioritize. So Alison, I'd love you to kind of finish us off here with your thoughts on this whole topic. What is kind of the biggest takeaway here? Like, what is the most important aspect of these pre-funnel stages and tracking that you want the audience to walk away with?
Yeah, so I think the key takeaway from this is the biggest kind of bang for your buck is going to be focusing on once someone becomes sales ready and optimizing that journey after that. Both from the perspective of your new business funnel, your expansion funnel, cross-sell funnel, and focusing on that and where the bottlenecks are really going to improve your pipeline, improve your revenue. And if you had to focus on one area, that's where we'd recommend focusing. In terms of the pre-funnel stages, we still would recommend tracking that. It's important to know whether your top of funnel investments are turning into those MQLs, but maybe not necessarily tracking it as a stage, but more looking at what are you doing to try to get those folks that have lightly engaged to more heavily engage and raise their hand and then convert. So I'd say that's the main takeaway today's session.
Awesome. Thank you, Alison. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate you listening to another one of our episodes here. If you have any feedback or want to give us a like on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast platform you listen on, that would be awesome and much appreciated. Also, if you have any questions, a lot of these questions pretty much coming from what we hear from our clients, what we hear from people in the community. But if you actually want to be a part of this podcast, you can send us an audio note, you can send us a video, and we'll probably pick a lot of these to really dictate the episode and dictate what we're going to be talking about and play it on the podcast. So if you do have a question, send us it in whatever format that's most comfortable for you, and we will tackle the most burning questions live on the podcast. So, and to be able to do that, send it to rga@cs2marketing.com. So thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time.